We're going to finish up this year in biology by discussing the urinary system. And I think this unit, in closing out, is going to be one of the easier units for you guys to deal with. I want to start out with a brief overview of the anatomy of the urinary system. First of all, the urinary system has to be fed and drained by a set of blood vessels, and above and below, the drainage is from the inferior vena cava. The actual vein that comes out of the kidney and goes into the inferior vena cava, is the renal vein. This is the kidney and is the central aspect of our filtering system. It is fed by the renal artery, which comes out of the descending aorta. The kidney, once it's filtered the blood and once the urine is formed, sends this urine into the ureter, which then travels down into the urinary bladder. And then lastly, as it exits the body, it exits through what is known as the urethra. So this picture right here gives you a brief overview of the structures involved in the urinary system. Now, let's get a closer view of the kidney. Now, the kidney is a fairly complex organ, and I want to go through this fairly slowly to make sure you get an opportunity to see exactly how the kidney works. First, the kidney is what is known as a retroperitoneal organ. The retroperitoneal organs are organs that are behind the parietal peritoneum. What that means is that if you make a incision in the abdomen and you look in, you'll see the large intestine and the small intestine and the stomach, and these are peritoneal organs. What you won't see easily is the kidney, because the kidneys are behind the sheath of tissue known as the parietal peritoneum, and you have to cut through that. You have to move all of the peritoneal organs out of the way and then slice through the peritoneum, the parietal peritoneum, to get to the kidney. In fact, when you operate on the kidney, you actually go in through the back, sort of the back and the side, as opposed from the front. Now, as we said before, the artery that feeds the kidney is known as the renal artery. And the vein that drains blood from the kidney is the renal vein. And these come into what is known as the renal pelvis. The urine goes down the ureter, as we've said before. Now, the ureters are the last part of what we see in this picture, but they start out as a confluence of the collecting system, and this confluence starts out from minor calyx, which is what is pointed at here, and then these two minor calyces come together to form what is called a major calyx at this point, and then all the major calyces come together to form what is known as the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is the part of the kidney where all of the urine is drained, but it's before you get to the ureter. Now, the outside part of the kidney, the part that goes from the outside capsule into where you see this obvious change in structure and color, this outside part is called the cortex of the kidney, or the renal cortex. The inside part, which is all the way until you get to the calyx, which is not easy to show here, but all the way in, that inside part is called the medulla, the renal medulla. So from the calyces out to the beginning of the cortex is the renal medulla, and then from the end of the medulla to the capsule is the renal cortex. Now, these bands of tissue that are in between are known as the renal column. The end of this area where the urine flow ends up going into the calyces, this is known as the renal papilla. And the renal papilla collects urine from the renal pyramid. And in between each renal pyramid is the renal column. And these structures come together to make up, and I'll show you exactly in the next slides, I'll show you exactly how urine is formed and what relationship it has to each of these structures. The outside of the kidney is called the renal capsule. So you see that as you go in from the outside, you start with the renal capsule, then the renal cortex, then the pyramids, and in between the pyramids are the renal columns. Then the most inside part of the pyramid is the renal papilla, or the papilla, and then you end up in the minor calyces. If you're going to follow the urine travel, the minor calyces coalesce to major calyces. These coalesce to the pelvis, and then the pelvis to the ureter. Now, the functional unit of the urinary system is the nephron. And this is a picture of a nephron. Now, the interesting thing about the nephron, as you look at it here, part of the nephron is in the cortex, and part of the nephron is in the medulla. So as this dotted line represents the division between the cortex and the medulla. And so the part of the nephron that's in the cortex is above the dotted line, and the part of the nephron that's in the medulla is in the lower part. And the first portion of the place where it all starts is where this arrow is, and this is called the glomerulus. And the glomerulus is the site where the filtration actually occurs. And the fluid filters out of the glomerular capillary, which is right where the arrow is pointing, into this little space around the glomerulus. And this space around the glomerulus is called Bowman's space. And the fluid goes from the glomerular capillary into Bowman's space and then begins to flow proximal to that. Now, the combination of the glomerulus and Bowman's space, that entire tuft of tissue, is called a renal corpuscle. Then fluid travels from Bowman's space, once it's filtered out of the glomerular capillary, filters into Bowman's space, then it goes into this proximal area where the tube begins to wind back and forth like a very windy mountain road. And this is called the proximal convoluted tubule. It then, after it's gone through the proximal convoluted tubule, it goes through this long looping structure down into the medulla and then back up to another convoluted area. And this long looping structure is called the loop of Henle. This whole portion that gets really thin goes down into the medulla and then back up, and that whole portion is called the loop of Henle. It then enters into another area of windy tubules, and this is called the distal convoluted tubule. Then it passes from the distal convoluted tubule into a larger structure that again goes down into the medulla, and at this point it continues down to the renal papilla and into the calyx, and this is called the collecting duct. Now, different things occur, and you see these arrows represent different occurrences at each portion of the nephron. Now, near the glomerulus, there's something called a juxtaglomerular apparatus. It's actually where these two bigger blood vessels come together to form the glomerulus. And right there is a tuft of several cells, and that's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And this is where erythropoietin is produced. Erythropoietin tells the bone marrow to make red blood cells. Erythropoiesis is the process of making red blood cells, and it is stimulated by erythropoietin, which comes from the kidney, which is why virtually all patients who have kidney disease are also anemic, and their anemia can be quite severe. It's because of failure of this portion of the kidney. Now this just is an overview of how urine actually forms. Blood comes in the afferent, that's AFF, arteriole, goes into the glomerular capillaries, and is filtered into Bowman's space, or Bowman's capsule. Then the blood comes out, the efferent arteriole, and that blood vessel actually goes by the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. And during this process, it's filtered, number one, at the glomerular area. In the proximal convoluted tubule, is primarily fluid is reabsorbed at that point. Distal convoluted tubule is where certain materials are secreted back into the tubule. And then lastly, the urine goes down the collecting duct and is excreted, and then the blood goes out the renal vein. So what you have is a large amount of material that's first filtered, and then most of it is then reabsorbed with a little bit secreted back, so that you start out with a large amount filtered, and then it's processed until a smaller amount is actually eventually secreted or excreted. So you have the process of filtration, which is where blood plasma minus the proteins are filtered by the nephron. So at the point of filtration, what is generally taken is the plasma, but the proteins themselves are not filtered. Then a major portion is reabsorbed in a process of reabsorption, primarily in the proximal convoluted tubule. Then certain chemicals are secreted back into the urine. And then lastly, in the last part, most of the water is reabsorbed so that the urine volume is controlled. And this is the stepwise process in urine formation. The glomerulus is the first point where this occurs. And what you have here is two pictures of the glomerulus, and it is designed to allow a maximum amount of fluid to be filtered through. And you can see the membrane is extremely thin, and on top of that there are actual holes that allow for the filtering of fluid, so that only the largest proteins are prevented from going through. The filtering is controlled by how fast the blood comes in. So the renal blood flow, which is generally about 20% of the cardiac output, controls how much blood goes through the kidneys, and by controlling that, it controls how much is filtered. And the filtration is called glomerular filtration. This is the rate at which this filtrate is formed, and this can be upwards of 100 to 120 cc's a minute. So a great deal of fluid is normally filtered in the kidney. But then, most of this is reabsorbed, and it's primarily reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. And what you see here is, on the left here is the urine side, and on the right is the blood vessel, or the efferent capillary. And there's both active transport of material, sodium and potassium, as well as passive transport of things such as chlorine, water, and urea. And this is all passed back into the blood vessel. Now there's a maximum that can be handled by the proximal tubule, and this is called the tubular maximum. This is the maximum rate of reabsorption by active transport. Now the third point is in the distal convoluted tubule, and I've got a little circle there. And what you can see is that there's active secretion at this point, of various electrolytes as well as water. Now, what we're going to talk about in a minute is how water is reabsorbed. And noticed on the left here the gradient of osmolarity, which is the gradient that allows for the reabsorption of water. And we'll talk about how that occurs in just a minute. But as this tube goes down into the medulla, it goes into a higher and higher osmolarity before it passes back out. And what allows for water to be reabsorbed is the fact that the permeability to water changes depending on where in the tubule you are. And this is how water is reabsorbed. This is called a countercurrent exchange system. And what happens is the filtrate first enters the descending limb and becomes more and more concentrated because it's going into an area of higher and higher osmolarity. So water is transferred from the urine across into the blood. The blood then removes the water, and at the same time, as it comes up the ascending limb, the electrolytes are pumped out so that the ascending limb becomes more and more, or less and less concentrated. And so this is how the urine is concentrated. And what you have going on here, on one side is the reabsorption of water, and on the other side is the pumping out of electrolytes to allow this countercurrent exchange to occur. So now once the urine has been formed, it goes down the ureters, and I've shown both a male and a female picture here. It goes down the ureters and into the bladder. And the bladder then, the difference is the presence of the prostate, which is just below the bladder in males. Women obviously don't have a prostate. And what happens as a person gets older is their prostate gets bigger and bigger and begins to obstruct this outlet. And that's why older men have more trouble with going to the bathroom than younger men do. And then obviously there's manual control, voluntary control of the output through the external sphincter. Women have a much shorter urethra, and because theirs is shorter, they are at a higher risk for infection. But at the same time, they do not develop the problems with urinary obstruction that men can develop. Now, the kidneys are also extremely, extremely important in the control of blood pressure. And this just shows how blood pressure is controlled. If the blood pressure goes down, then the kidney has to respond to that. And the kidney's primary response to that is to secrete the hormone renin. When the hormone renin is secreted, it then travels and is converted to a hormone called angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is a direct vasoconstrictor, so it directly raises blood pressure by causing vasoconstriction. Angiotensin II also causes the release of aldosterone by the adrenal gland, and aldosterone causes the reabsorption of salt, and in doing that it increases the plasma volume, which also increases the blood pressure. And then thirdly, angiotensin also causes the release of antidiuretic hormone, which helps hold on to water as well. So everything on the left side acts to raise the blood pressure. And many blood pressure treatments are directed toward blocking angiotensin II, either by its conversion from renin to angiotensin II or directly blocking the effect of angiotensin II. Now on the other side, on the right here, is atrial natriuretic peptide, which does exactly the opposite. It is released by the left atrium, right atrium, and it acts by being a vasodilator. It blocks the excretion of aldosterone and ADH, and it also blocks the excretion of renin. So if the blood pressure gets too high, then atrial natriuretic peptide acts to try to lower blood pressure. This is the renin-angiotensin axis, and this is the hormone system centering in the kidney that acts as a vascular constrictor to keep the blood pressure up. Aldosterone, as you know from our hormone lecture, increases the blood pressure by increasing salt reabsorption, along with ADH, which causes increased water reabsorption. The other thing that the kidneys do, in addition to helping control blood pressure, is act on controlling the acid-base balance in the blood. If you have too much acid, the term acidosis is used. If you have too much base, the term alkalosis is used. So an acidosis is an increase of acid in the blood with a decrease in pH. An alkalosis is a decrease in acid in the blood with a concomitant increase in pH. And I know that you all haven't heard of pH before, or some of you haven't, but we'll talk about that in chemistry class. It's just a way of measuring acid concentration and base concentration. The blood basically has a buffering system to prevent changes in pH, and the buffering system centers around carbon dioxide and bicarbonate. And if there's too much alkaline, the kidney can get rid of that by excreting bicarbonate. The respiratory system can get rid of acid by breathing out carbon dioxide. And I'll show you how that works in just a second. So here's how it works. I know this looks a little complicated, this equation, but it's not as complicated as it looks. In the middle is normal. You have a buffering system with equal amounts of the acid, which is acetic acid, and its ion, which is acetic acid without the hydrogen, okay, or acetate ion. If there's acid is added, so that you have the situation on the left, then what happens is that the equation shifts to try to remove that acid, okay? You have too much of the acid in the pink here, so it's going to try to shift to form more acetate and more ion. Once that occurs, you can get rid of this by breathing out carbon dioxide. On the other side, on the right side, you have a situation where too much base is present. It shifts in exactly the opposite direction in an attempt to get rid of that. In doing so, there forms bicarbonate, and bicarbonate is then excreted in the urine to try to get rid of that. During all of this time, what is attempted is to keep things as it is in the middle. So that ends the lecture. I decided not to do two parts because I knew I only had about 25 minutes of talking. I want to end by saying how much I enjoyed talking with you all and having you be a part of our time together. And I'm wishing you good